I think we have an obligation to look at programs and countries that seem to be addressing their problems head on, and not, we live in a society where we have some really messed up thoughts about things. And kind of at the beginning of this, we were talking about, alcohol is legal, but it causes more problems, than, many other things in our society. Yet we continue to have our head in the sand.
Welcome back to the Sina Good Health Podcast. Once again, we're talking with my mother-in-law, Shelly Petrick. So today, we're going to talk about, I saw a video, Joe Rogan and Malcolm Gladwell were talking about why alcohol gets a pass in society, so I just thought it'd be interesting to get an addiction counselor perspective on it. So the video talks about how alcohol should be the most taboo, and then cigarettes, and then weed, and Malcolm Gladwell is basing that off of social harm. So I guess my question is, let's start off with, if it was flipped and marijuana was like how alcohol is now, would that be causing the amount of social harm, do you think?
It's an interesting concept. I think if marijuana was in first place in terms of taboo, if we were flipping that, is what you're asking?
If marijuana was as ubiquitous and commonly used as alcohol is now, and alcohol was, let's just say, semi-illegal in some areas and kind of maybe on its way, but...
Okay. That's an interesting concept. And it's a little hard to fathom because alcohol is so much more widely used than marijuana. And the effects do not appear to be as widespread as that of alcohol. But we know there are effects, and I think part of the issue with marijuana is we're not sure what some of the long-term effects of marijuana are. But it appears to be, on the surface, a safer drug for some people,
right,
than alcohol. And I don't know that we, have a real good handle on how widespread the use of marijuana is, because it's not legal everywhere, or it's legal in some form, rather than the traditional, smoking. We've got edibles now, and in some states the use of medicinal marijuana is not, traditional marijuana that, that you smoke, and I think some people aren't, even aware of that. So I don't think, it's really hard to compare, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, because the largest difference being one is legal and one is not, and people are just more open and apt to talk about something that's legal versus illegal,
right,
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You and I would not have difficulty talking about how much we had to drink over the last month, but we might shy away from, that same conversation as, related to marijuana.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it sounds like it's like you're saying, it's very hard to, like you said, fathom this, because it's such a hypothetical scenario that's not likely to happen in reality. And if it does, it's going to be over a couple hundred years as culture shifts and everything.
Right. I think, when we look at use of chemicals from an addiction standpoint, and I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, so that's what I'm always looking at. Asking people, their use of chemicals and the purpose, in which they use them. So, why do you drink? Why do you smoke dope? Why do you, watch porn? Why do you, whatever addiction they have, what is the driving force that they are doing that? And that really is the key to discovering why people use chemicals in any form or fashion. You can ask anybody who partakes in drinking, because again, that's socially acceptable. And the purpose of that video was, why does alcohol get a pass? Because it's socially acceptable. If you ask any person who partakes in alcohol, why do you drink? A large percentage of adult Americans would say to relax, to kick back, to have a good time when I'm with my friends over the holidays, things like that. Those are going to be the people that more likely than not do not struggle with some type of substance abuse or misuse or dependence. But that small subset of people that do have that obsession and compulsion to use substances, oftentimes there's a deeper drive that they have for the continued use of a chemical. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And that is the challenge to really figure out, what is it that they're having difficulty coping with that takes them back to the use of a chemical to be able to handle that. And typical, it's related to, some type of emotion or social inadequacy of some kind.
Right. So, because Jordan Peterson talks about you need to have a bigger mission or something that makes it's something that's more important than getting drunk, because he has a thing that's the question shouldn't be why do people drink or do drugs, it's why aren't they doing them all the time?
Okay, so at some level, again from an addiction perspective, they have developed an ability to cope with, say, a stressor, in their life that has replaced, the need for using, chemicals or alcohol at that time. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's not a need to use on a continual basis, or you're simply in a situation that prevents you, say, at your job, or, around other people that don't use, that it may be taboo, and you are simply respecting that, I don't use at my parents' home, I don't use while I'm at work, but any other time might be fair game for me.
Yeah, and that makes me wonder about more, I'll say, socially acceptable addictions. Two I think that are most common are if someone gets addicted to working out, or just work, throwing themselves into their job.
Mm-hmm. So anytime we have addictions to other things, and like you mentioned, that might be socially acceptable, when it becomes problematic is when it starts to impact other areas of our life, right? Some people would say, oh, being a workaholic isn't the worst thing, right? And we really buy into that as Americans.
Right.
We are heavy into, work equals money equals success equals things that I can have, and on and on and on. But there becomes an imbalance in other areas of our life. Perhaps my spouse doesn't like the fact that I work as hard as I do. Or I'm feeling like I don't have enough leisure time in my life, and I'm starting to pay the price in terms of, you know, mind, body, you know, balance, spiritual balance. Because we really need to have, you know, a sense of balance in several quadrants in our life, being, you know, the physical, emotional, spiritual, mental. And if we're pouring everything into, you know, work or working out or, you know, whatever it is that's become our thing, we're likely neglecting other areas which are as important in our life.
Yeah. So I think it was a fitness guy, he talked about just he'll every so often draw like a circle and use different spokes to represent different aspects of his life, like you're saying, like family, spiritual stuff, work, you know, his own health. Like, so I guess what are your thoughts about like what do you do to balance that? Like, does everything need to be exactly 50-50, or like, you know, prioritizing something? Like,
I don't think it's always going to be even at all times. I mean, we can say like you were kind of talking about symbolically, like if I have a pie and I divide it up, you know, how much energy am I putting into each of those things? I think that's really going to waver.
like different seasons of life kind of thing?
Seasons of life, seasons in general, you know, like well, you didn't mention this, but we're on vacation. That's why you're seeing kind of a strange background. We're in a cabin on a lake in central Minnesota, you know, on vacation right now. And so right now, we're completely filling up that recreation, leisure, spiritual bucket, right? We're spending time in nature, we're doing what we love, we're out paddleboarding and kayaking and floating and drinking alcohol and, you know, right? We're doing all of those things that fill us in, you know, that emotional, mental, spiritual realms, right? Emotional as well. I'm spending time with my kids, I'm having a great time. But this isn't a typical week also, right? So when I'm at my work week, I have to figure out how I can incorporate elements of this week into my normal week, right? That may be, you know, taking my beloved dog here, you know, on, you know, a walk every night. Whereas, you know, right now she's loving it because she's getting, you know, 24-hour-a-day attention, you know, right now. But, so, does that...
Yeah, oh, and it sounds like there's the scope of like a year or a life or season or whatever, and then so you got to balance stuff within that level, but then also within a day or a week, also managing those different components.
Right.
So.
Absolutely. And daily is, I mean, even if you break down a day, like say you're trying to, you know, increase physical health, for example.
Yeah.
You know, and I struggle with this, you know, personally. I think, oh, I'm going to do better at, you know, exercising 30 minutes a day. You know, you say that statement, and it's like 30 minutes a day. You know, there's 24 hours in a day. How is it so impossible for me to slice 30 minutes out of that time?
Right.
But then I look back and I think, oh, I had an excuse Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I'm going to hit it Thursday. That seems like a good day. But then I only have so many fingers left, right, for the rest of the week. And so it's hard. So we have to be very, very mindful about how we're filling those buckets, those quadrants, those pieces of the pie. And we almost have to schedule them in like they are as important as an appointment that I have with a client or, you know.
Yeah. So one concept that's making me think of is, so Tim Urban, he wrote a really good article, and it's also a TED Talk about why procrastinators procrastinate. And he's got a concept in there called the dark playground, which is when you're sitting down to do homework, a report, some kind of important thing that may not be fun to do, but instead of getting started, you're screwing around looking at YouTube videos or whatever social media stuff, and it's not that fun, but it's a distraction. And then he compares that to like after you've gotten the work done and you can kind of fully enjoy X, Y, and Z, like if it is the YouTube video, or if it's like for myself, like it's like I may not want to, it may be hard for my brain to justify playing a video game instead of doing homework, but I can watch like 8 YouTube videos, because that's, you know, it's always that just one more or whatever until you actually get started. So.
Yeah, I think I want to say it's human nature to be a little bit that way, to put pleasure before pain. I mean, I think there's a, you know, a real tendency for people to do that. One way, you know, to combat that is, and this I read somewhere, and I can't remember who to give credit to for this, but but to do those things at the beginning of the day, like to make those tasks that I need to do that are, you know, perhaps less pleasant than other things that I want to do, the first or second or third thing that I tackle in a day, so I'm actually getting it done, versus that feeling of getting 10 things, you know, that I like to do that give me, you know, reward or pleasure, because we have those too. You know, there's certain parts of our job that we, you know, like to do more than others. So how can I, you know, click off those things that are less desirable, that's going to make maybe those things that I do enjoy better, even that more delightful. And then, you know, I get to do what I want it, you know, what I want to do, you know, at the end of the day, and can do that guilt-free, you know, versus...
And that's the guilt is the big word there.
Because then we really do experience joy, right? You know, unmitigated joy, just like I can do whatever my passion is without having that, oh, you would enjoy this a whole lot more if you would have gotten X, Y, or Z done and not carried it over to tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. So, because what's interesting to me is like, sometimes the thing that you've been doing takes like 10 freaking minutes, and it's kind of like your 30 minutes of working out. You've got the whole 24 hours, and it's like, why do we run away from that pain that we can just bang out?
I don't have a good answer for that. I really don't. But I do know that if you just make progress towards that, because in my field of work, we have a saying that says progress, not perfection, right? Every day, if we're just getting, and I think that's a great way to look at anything, you know, like if you're at least starting something or making, you know, even if it's a baby step towards a goal you're working on, is better than sitting on the couch, right? I mean, it's, even if you're looking up YouTube videos how to do whatever it is you want to do, at least it's dropping those seeds, right? And then we're gonna water them, and then we're gonna, you know, fertilize, and you know, and then they're gonna blossom. But sometimes it just takes surrounding ourselves with, you know, information, people that are good at what we want to do, talking about it, doing research, things like that, is changing our mindset. Because if we can change our thoughts, we can change our behaviors, right? So, but it all starts up here. So maybe we are doing things that are planting the seeds of change, and we're going to get there. But as long as we're working on it in some small way, that can still be considered progress.
Yeah. So there's two different directions that I want to go. So one is, and this is probably, we'll go with the one that I don't think will get us off track as much. So you talked about for in addiction counseling, like progress, not perfection. So in the treatment process, like what does that look like? Like you talked about, like people are using alcohol or drugs to cope with stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So is it like responding to
So
stressors in
yeah,
a more
progress
positive way?
is exactly exactly that. Progress, not perfection. So in therapy, one of the things that we teach is called mindfulness. Okay, mindfulness being aware of your surroundings, being aware of your thoughts, being aware of your thoughts related to your surroundings and things that are, kind of in your realm of consciousness. Therapy can bring about a lot of things that individuals have had suppressed for a long time. They may not even be aware of. And so there's different forms of therapy that, individuals can partake in, to help with that process. They have to be open and willing to take that journey. And because it can open up doors that may be more like a Pandora's box versus
Right.
a nice gentle door that's opening. That's how we want to kind of perceive how therapy's going to go, slow and deliberate and, taking people where they want to go. That isn't always the case, particularly when individuals may be dealing with some sort of trauma or abuse of some kind. So sometimes just having, events or memories come to the surface can bring about lots of feelings for people, from fear to anxiety, terror maybe, if it's, trauma related, uneasiness, maybe and so sometimes initial work can surround just identifying those feelings. What is it that you're thinking about, and what are those emotions, thoughts, and feelings related, to those memories. And so that can be significantly hard work for people, depending on how long those things have been buried or how intense those things are.
Yeah. Well, and in our previous talk, we did talk about, like, you have the feelings chart and just, like you're saying, identifying emotions. So, and what seems hard is, like, in, I'll just say, American culture, it might be other places too, but it's like, there's not, like, in therapy, there's not like okay, I will do X, Y, and Z, and then I'm cured. It's like how do you work with something that's abstract?
Right, so I have several little signs and pictures and things in my office, but my favorite one is one that says enjoy the journey. And I think if we can think of our life as a journey or a trip, road trip, of versus like there's little destinations that we have to reach, and then we have fulfilled something in our life. So that's why I kind of have a love-hate relationship with goals, because we set these goals, and goals are great, goals are fine, but sometimes they can also be barriers or roadblocks or what ifs. What if I don't get my degree by the time I'm 22? Oops, something happened. I got sick. I got whatever, I moved, I got married, whatever. And so we have to be flexible enough to give ourselves, grace, to accept that everything might not be this linear, upward linear path that we kind of envision our life to be. And versus there's going to be twists and turns and dead ends and, but it's a journey. And we're going to be happier on that journey if we can embrace the wandering at times, the dead ends, the roadblocks, and the U-turns. Quite honestly, that happen maybe when we're least expecting them. So if we can find joy along the way, because we know there's going to be trying times. We know that. Things are going to happen to us. We're going to lose jobs. People are going to die. We're going to get sick. I mean, those are just givens. But our attitude and how we embrace those things are going to keep us either on a path of health and wellness or sickness and destruction.
Sure.
And we want health and wellness, but sometimes our actions don't always support that.
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering about, because like Scott Adams writes about in his book, it's more important to have building systems than goals. And that means like basically setting up systems to kind of set up your life to get you what you want. And I guess I'm wondering, like, do you think that's the more important thing?
Yeah. And I'm not sure quite what he's referring to with systems, but I think that's true. I think that's kind of what I was alluding to a little bit ago. Goals are usually, defined.
Well, like, to make it simple, like, let's just say, like, a weight loss thing, because that's a pretty common goal, is like, I need to be 180 pounds or whatever. And, like, instead of that, focusing on just setting up your life where you're eating healthy and getting decent exercise.
Absolutely.
And that creating that kind of system for your life more than focusing on the goal.
Oh, I absolutely think that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. We get very specific versus maybe if we stayed more in the generalities, we might hit closer to our mark. Versus becoming so fixated on that exact point. Like, what is going to happen if I reach that mark, other than some sort of, individual woohoo, versus if I really am changing my system, getting daily exercise, eating better, drinking more water, doing things that are gonna, certainly support that goal without focusing on that one specific thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for anything that we talk about in our life.
Yeah. Well, and like just hypothetically, this weight loss goal, like the person, they join like some kind of like a tennis, like some kind of sport club league thing, and make friends, and then they can hang out with them instead of their bar friends necessarily. Just like there's different indirect ways to kind of improve your life too.
Absolutely, because by doing that, we're making those social connections, which are so hugely important for us in terms of our emotional health and our mental health. And they help fill those buckets.
Right. So going back to like the treatment, and we're assuming that a person coming to addiction treatment has hit some kind of low point where they may not have a lot going on in their lives. So with the recovery process, and with Jordan Peterson talking about you need something bigger, like, but if they may not have the, like, let's just say they've they've burned bridges or lost trust with their family and haven't been able to hold down a job and whatever, like, how do you start rebuilding that to give them that bigger mission to make that more important than the drinking? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
So addiction treatment really, it's a lot about grieving losses, which sounds, a little crazy, but it's not just the losses that they've experienced, maybe relationship, job, social connections, things that they used to enjoy, all of those things because of their usage. But it's also, saying goodbye to that drug that has filled every need that they have had. So it's the loss of that one good thing that has solved every problem that they've had. It hasn't, but it did, it did its job. And so that's the hardest part is alcohol or a chemical has done what it intended to do, what you wanted it to do. It has numbed every feeling. It has made you forget things. You have blacked out. You have forgotten what you have done. And if that was the goal of using, it has succeeded, right? So that's why relapse is so almost certain in this field. Some people don't like to hear that, but it's part of the disease process.
Sure.
Because it works. It has worked. So when things get tough, we tend to go back to what works, right? Maybe that's food, maybe that's shopping, maybe that, those things that we think make us feel better. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, it's kind of grieving those losses. The loss of things that have happened as a result of my addiction, but also the loss of the drug itself. And then we start, and that takes about 30 days, And then the hard part really comes in, because I tell clients all the time, the easy part is quitting. That's the easiest part. And they're like, what? Because at that point in their journey, they perceive that as the most difficult. Because you're physically still craving, the drug. Mentally, you're craving it. Emotionally, you're craving it. But the hard part really comes when you have essentially detoxed from the chemical, and that's going to be different for whatever, chemical we're talking about. But then how can I replace all of that? How can I, first and foremost, address the pain of these feelings that I'm having for the first time in a long time, because they're all over the place. And so they're feeling a little way out of their comfort zone. Pardon me, and then start replacing all of those feelings, a lot of them which are negative, anxiety, depression, oh my gosh, loss, grief, all of that, with more joy. How do I go back to doing things that made me happy? How can I start building relationships with people that I really care about, versus drug acquaintances, because they begin to realize that those people that they were using with weren't really friends. They were just people that I used with, what you and I might consider an acquaintance.
Sure.
And that's hard because sometimes it's a challenge for anybody to think about and remember things that they enjoyed that brought them joy. Maybe I'll just use this, maybe they enjoyed running, but they've used chemicals or alcohol for the last X amount of years and they're in no shape to do that. So maybe they begin by walking, just get out and walking a couple times a day to start, building up that endurance, and so then we would work with them on, how do you keep adding that to, maybe there's, a goal that you have. Maybe you want to walk or run a 5K by the end of the summer, which for a lot of people, I think would be doable.
Sure.
You know, and so replace that grief and loss emotion, negative emotions, with more joy, more gratitude, more gratefulness.
Just with people that have addiction problems and the rest of us kind of, I feel like there's a level of looking down on them for that, like punishment, and I don't know, does that make sense?
Well, I think societally, sure, people will still look at individuals who are in recovery or in the depths of their addiction and say, why can't they just stop?
Right.
And, it's just because it's easy for you and I to say, but it's not easy for someone who's addicted. They're literally, we know their brains are wired differently than ours, and there is not an ability to just say no. It requires much more than that. But I think the more that we can do talks like this, and we can get the word out, and when people are comfortable sharing their story, there's not a person, I believe this, that can't hear somebody's story and say, I know somebody, or my brother, or my uncle, or my aunt, or my son, but they can relate to the story. May not completely understand it, but they can relate, or they know somebody who has struggled. And I think the more that we can, destigmatize and normalize, what it means to have a substance use disorder problem, that's going to go a long ways in helping us understand what other people are going through.
Yeah, and I'll ask you about this, and if you don't know a lot about it, that's fine. I was reading about, I think it's Chile, where they legalized everything, and they put all the money that was going towards I'll just call it the war on drugs, and instead put that into treatment. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that kind of approach?
Well, it certainly showed promise in other countries as well. I'm not as familiar with Chile, but I think we have an obligation to look at programs and countries that seem to be addressing their problems head on, and not we live in a society where we have some really messed up thoughts about things, and kind of at the beginning of this we were talking about alcohol is legal, but it causes more problems than many other things in our society, yet we continue to have our head in the sand about that very issue. We're every state, and I may be speaking out of turn with that, but many states in the United States are looking at some sort of legalization of marijuana. Look at a state like Colorado, who has had legalized marijuana for many years now, and some of the issues that they are having across the board are not pretty, folks. I mean, there's a reason their law enforcement was, against legalization, at many costs. So I think we have an obligation to look at, both the good, the bad, and the ugly about what's happening. The use of drugs in society has been and always will be a supply and demand issue, always and forever. And as long as there's a demand, the supply is going to come. Just like prohibition, back in the 20s, they tried to make that, and what happened? It all went underground. Didn't stop people from drinking. In fact, there was the enticement that, because we like
Stick
that,
it to the man a little bit,
Yeah, if something is, I'm not, it's like that whole teenage mentality. If you tell me I can't do it, I'm for certain going to seek it out, right? That's just adolescent,
Right.
behavior and mentality. And I think, that is similar for drugs, for a certain segment of the population. You are
Yeah.
always going to have a certain subset that are going to say, nope, something's illegal, I'm not going to do it. But then you're going to always have the testers and then the people that are just, going to make a point to go out and do it just because it is illegal.
Right. So there's two different things that you made me think of. So one is like, there's what was it? I think it was some fitness guy I follow. He talked about how he's a parent of two younger kids, and he heard one of them say a swear word, and so instead of just scolding them, he taught them, well, he set up some rules of like, you can only swear at home, like in front of me, not at school or whatever, and then he taught them like all the swear words, and he said that what ended up happening was for like 2 days they were running around swearing nonstop, and then the novelty wore off. So, and then the other thing I was going to bring up was like drinking in Europe. Like I think the drinking age is significantly lower. It's like 14 or whatever, depending on the country maybe.
Yeah.
So, and I feel like you're getting at, like, since alcohol is so celebrated in a lot of cultures, is it less of a big deal there? So it's kind of that same thing with the parenting teenage rebellion.
Well, it definitely is socially acceptable in Europe on kind of a different level. As Americans, we tend to do everything to the extreme.
Right.
And I don't know what our fascination with that is. I think some of it is, how America was built, like go big, go home, find the gold, travel far. I mean, I don't, but we have an obsession with competition and doing things bigger and better than our neighbor. And, and it sets us up for constant competition. And I think it becomes kind of a sickness, and I really wish we could get away from that. And I don't know how, because it's very difficult to change societal norms. Because once they kind of take hold, it's very difficult, to change them. And man, we are living in a climate of polarization, right now, whether it's, political or, whatever you're talking about, everything seems to be the extreme. And I think, we just really are going to have to go more towards the center. What you were referring to is almost like immersion, like I'm going to just, I can't even remember the exact situation, but somebody when I was younger found out their kid was smoking. And so they sat him down at the table and said, okay, you're going to smoke this entire pack of cigarettes, thinking they were, teaching them some lesson. Well, can you imagine smoking a pack of cigarettes in a short amount of time? I mean, I remember my first cigarette in the park across from school, and I, first time I inhaled, I thought I was going to pass out. It was horrible. But, the damage that you might cause. So I think of those kind of things, and, I'm a little bit, repulsed by them. I've known people similar, situations with drinking. If you're going to drink, drink the 6-pack and, puke, and then you'll know that you don't want to do that anymore. Well, teenagers are going to be curious. They're going to do, their own thing. So I think, if we can do some normalization of that, and I mean, my personal approach was, I'm not so naive to think that you're not going to do these things, but let's set some parameters around how this can be done safely. And I'm not condoning underage drinking or anything like that, so don't take that as the message. But just, some rules around that. If you're going to drink, stay where you're at, give a responsible person the car keys, nobody's leaving. And I tell my adult kids, this as well, if you're going to go out and have a good time at a bar, call me. I don't want you driving after you've had a few drinks. I don't want you to have the consequences. Clearly nobody intends on anything horrible happening, but bad things happen. And so how can we be safe around those things? So I think as parents, really if we can kind of gravitate towards that middle ground and not the extreme, maybe the conservative extreme over here that, my kids are never going to be allowed to do these things, or so passive over here that, kids will be kids and they're going to do what they want anyway. But somewhere in that middle ground, that acknowledging, the realities of the world, but yet how can I still, place, what I want for my children, as a priority, but understanding that there's going to be pressures and temptations. That's what I've tried to strive for, and that seemed to work for my family.
Yeah, well, in a previous podcast that you haven't seen yet, but I was talking with a pastor about church and how the parenting going, and I talked with you about this too, because I talked to him. Anyway, kind of being a model yourself with I'll just say enjoying, and we talked about this in the last podcast too, enjoying alcohol responsibly, having one or two at a holiday or whatever, and just kind of modeling, I'll say, healthy use of alcohol. That's part of the parenting thing too, and giving them that norm so they don't need to do the rebellion and go to the extreme of chugging a whole bottle or whatever. And so I do have, were you gonna go on something? Okay, so I did have a question with in the Joe Rogan video we've been talking about, Joe does clarify that he doesn't have a problem with drinking alcohol occasionally, and I mean, we both know there are people that have that, I don't know what the term is, but addiction trigger or whatever. So my question is, with marijuana, if that was going to be the allowed thing, because Joe Rogan says that people that have a problem with pot is rare, and he says it's possibly an underlying schizophrenic issue. In your experience, is it the same kind of thing where a percentage of people have a problem with pot, or what?
I would say the people that will just smoke and smoke and smoke and smoke, are pretty rare. I mean, I would say the majority of marijuana users are going to use for recreational or medicinal uses. It's pretty rare that now, when people have addiction issues and or mental health issues, they may subscribe to continual use of marijuana on a consistent basis. They may say, I smoke pot like cigarettes, all day. Typically, when I am working with someone, in that we're dealing with some sort of mental health issue, that has become the coping mechanism of choice, for that person. And typically that a lot of times, surrounds anxiety, social anxiety, anxiety of any kind, that marijuana helps address that. Or, a variety of mental health issues that just helps take them to a place where things are more manageable for them. Much like medicinal use of marijuana, managing pain. People who smoke marijuana can get very specific with you, I find, than maybe any other drug about why they use it, which is interesting to me. They'll say, I smoke marijuana because, and they're able to fill in the blank, versus, and an opiate user or an alcohol user, they may have, a wide variety of reasons why they use. But marijuana, single-handedly, they can almost always tell you why they're using it, in what situation and what for.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So, I'm just trying to, we've jumped all over my questions out of order, which is fine. So, let's see.
You girl.
Okay, so one thing that, let me see if there's, so let's just go on this tangent and see what happens. So one thing I was going to ask about is, like, and I can't remember the context where this idea came from, but I want to talk about the concept of, like, boredom, and people are sometimes, like we were talking about with the procrastination stuff, they're afraid of just kind of sitting with the problem to try to figure it out or face it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can be using alcohol or whatever drugs, but just that concept of people seem like they're afraid of boredom, like they're afraid of what their own minds will come up with.
Uh-huh. And yes, almost number one or two answer when you ask people why they use, or a trigger for using, is I'm bored. And as I've shared with you before, that one always just, like, shocks me, because as a person who has never been bored since they were like 9 years old, I just simply don't understand. I just really, I get it, but I don't understand it, because I shouldn't say I don't understand, I have a hard time relating.
Yes.
Is probably the more appropriate way to say that.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I think kids, and I think we do this to kids, starting at a young age, and I see this in society as a whole. We have programmed our kids to be so reliant on doing things versus encouraged to use their imaginations. We just simply were not as busy as kids are today. Growing up, we were we were happy with less. We played more. We had to use our imaginations more. And I see this as a big problem with, and I'm going to say kids today, but I think it's with people in general, having to use their imagination, picking up a book, reading, expanding their mind, using inventive play, versus just this constant busyness. And I got wrapped up with it with my own kids, to a certain extent. I was really thankful my kids were not into video, anything like that, though. I mean, that just was,
games.
yeah, it just wasn't a thing in our house, maybe because I had all girls and they're not as, apt to do those things. I don't know. That's being very stereotypical and sexist, I realize, but I can't relate to that because my kids weren't interested in that. But, so yeah, boredom is huge. And again, it's how can we get people to tap into hobbies, leisure activities, because individuals that have those things in their life, they can't get enough of it. Like whether it's hunting, fishing, sports, playing games or on a pickleball, whatever it is. They love it. Woodworking, sewing, scrapbooking, whatever your thing is. Have a passion. You can meet people through your passion. You can make social connections. You can have teams. You can do individual, work. But boredom, number one problem with individuals in addiction.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering about because I just think about adults, even just the second there's a pause, they're on their phones,
Mm-hmm.
It gets nuts to me.
Well, exactly, and social media has not helped,
Mm-hmm.
in that regard either, because we'll just sit back, pull up something to watch, and now the TikTok things, people will watch them, make them, and you might get a good laugh, a 30-second laugh, but then it's becomes, minutes and hours of
You need the next
wasted
hit
time.
Yeah.
But my opinion only on that.
Right. Well, yeah, the other thing I was going to bring up when you were talking about that was I remember I don't know where it's from, but there was a thing where they looked at in kindergarten, 98% of the kids have creativity, whatever, and then by the time they get through high school, it's 5% or whatever, and just the education kind of looking for the one right answer and that approach and kind of killing the creative thought.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be its own podcast.
True, and yeah, I think you're right. But I think it's become so much of what we have to teach in school versus what do kids really need.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I can ask you that with what do kids need, and we've talked about with addiction treatment, learning, recognizing your feelings and coping, and it's so what about how to handle those? Because I think you've talked about in the previous podcast or whatever, but because you're reaching for alcohol to cope when something bad happens, when you're trying to, because you're going back to a familiar pattern. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess what in the treatment process do you learn the social skills and stuff so you're not dependent on drinking to be sociable?
Yeah, so one of the things that I talked about was feeling identification, and then what I call sitting with those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
We do not do well with discomfort.
Right.
We want to ease it away, in any way possible. And we struggle with seeing other people in pain. And sometimes the very best thing we can do is just sit with somebody in a uncomfortable feeling. Just sit with them. It's amazing to me in the group process, we'll have something that is, a discussion that's maybe triggering someone. and they have an emotional, I'll just call it an emotional breakthrough of some kind. It's something that we're talking about is triggering them, and they're having an emotional response. We are so quick to want to, rush over, grab the Kleenex, give it to them, pat, do you need a hug? And I'll say, we're just going to stop for a minute, and I just want everybody to be quiet. Just sit with your own thoughts for a minute. And I have no problem sitting there for many, many, many minutes. The person who is experiencing an emotional response of some kind has no sense of time.
Right.
And so it's really, the onus is really on everybody else to respect that pain and that process to happen, because it's cathartic for them. Something is happening with them that needs to happen. That pain has got to be released because we can only carry it around for so long. And so the challenge is really with the group to allow that process to happen. At one point, and then at some point I will say, are you comfortable talking about what just happened? And sometimes they'll say, I don't know. And that's not them trying to deflect. They just don't know.
Processing and figuring it out.
And that can take a very long time. Like somebody might need literally the rest of the day to just have permission to not be okay for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
They may be short with people, they may be snippy, they might need to sleep. They might need to go for a walk. They might, everybody has their own way of, they might need to put on headphones. They might just need to escape in some way because they're doing it differently, maybe for the very first time. Because I'm not allowing them to have that crutch that has always worked for them.
Yeah.
So sitting with discomfort is incredibly hard for people in general. Because we want to fix it. And the very best thing we can do for anybody, and we see this with people who have lost and are grieving. Maybe they're attending a funeral. And we become very uncomfortable, right? In fact, we will say things like, I really wanted to call and see how they were doing, but I didn't know what to say. We're hung up on that. We don't like to go see people in the nursing home because what if they don't know me? What if I don't know what to say to them? Just ask them how they are, So it's really, really important for people to be able to just process that moment, that 10 minutes, that whatever it is that they're experiencing, and that can be any time, any time in a person's life. Just sit with them. And just sit and share the moment, and don't try to fix. Let them talk when they're ready, but just understand that might be a while before they're able to do that.
Yeah, and that just reminds me of like the classic relationship advice for guys is like just shut up and listen to the woman.
Yes, because women are better at that, typically. Again, that's stereotypical, but it's,
right.
Oftentimes the truth. They're better at emoting than men are. Mm-hmm. But when you can get a man to do it, it's awesome. Because they're probably having a cathartic moment. Some sort of lines or dots or whatever are lining up for them. Mm-hmm. And something is coming together for people and a lot of times, with somebody who has used for a long time, this might be something that's been buried a very long time, or a memory that they may not even be conscious about.
Yeah. And the other thing I was thinking about was like, because you were talking about just sitting and just giving them time to kind of think. And that just also like reminds me of like with autism, that's a pretty common frustration, is like just taking the time to figure out to how to articulate what you're thinking or feeling. And I know I mean, you can probably see it if you're watching all these podcasts. Like, I'm trying to think of questions and also process what she's saying, and that's why I've got my questions ahead of time and everything. So that's something that I wish, I don't know, socially maybe that would be a thing. It's just, you know, like if you're not constantly talking, this person's going to jump and you don't get to say what you were trying to. And
Mm-hmm.
let's see. I'm just going through and seeing what else
Mm-hmm.
we had. Because I think, like, yeah, that was really good stuff you were talking about with, like, just having that breakthrough and just sitting, and they might need the day to kind of process it, because that feels relatable. Like, I've probably had those kind of experiences.
Well, I think it's just great advice, if you will, for anybody about anything. You know, we were talking about kids a minute ago. Kids do not have rapid fire ways of dealing with their feelings. And so it's just good parental advice too. You know, like if your kid is feeling all sorts of something or other, just let them have that feeling and recognize that people don't always have the words when they're at an elevated state or in an emotional state. Particularly an elevated state when they're a kid, they might be all sorts of, tantruming or, whatever, and just, I read something recently, God, it was just great, it was on Facebook, of course, that, oh, gosh, I'm not going to remember it, but when people are excited, they need less words. And when they're, calm, you can use more words. And I think that's just so true, because like when kids are, having it, what are we doing? We're calm down, stop crying, go to your room, and they just simply can't hear it, so the best thing you can do is sit with them, or safety, right? Come here, let me just get you close, but I'm not saying anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just taking you in. You're safe with me, and I will let you express yourself once you calm down. But trying to get somebody to do that when they're all anxious they can't hear you. They can't see you, they can't hear you, they can't do anything because they're emoting, right? And so the more that we can remember that with anybody who's in any sort of pain, the more effectively we're going to reach them. Mm-hmm. And so, that's probably a great place to just, a last thought to leave with people is, the more elevated you are, the less external stuff that you need. And when you're at a calmer place, then you can take more of that in.
Yeah, and I'll just add, that is something that my wife and I, your daughter, do, is like if we're having an argument, or even if we just have a bad day and we're not ready to talk about it, we'll just say to each other, like, I'm not ready to talk about it yet, mm-hmm. or I don't think I'm in a good headspace to talk about this issue, mm-hmm. and we'll just let it go.
And what a great way to save a marriage, like all joking aside though.
Yeah.
But if more people were able to just say, wow, I've got so much going on up here right now that mm-hmm. I'm not sure it would come out nice or come out a way in which I want it to or I intend it to.
Right.
And come back later, versus, like, I can only imagine how many arguments start at the beginning of the day or at dinner time. Like the two most times of the day versus, can we talk after the kids are in bed? Or after we've had dinner and had a minute to process our day. Imagine how much nicer things might come out. Good advice for everybody in the world, right?
Yeah.
Or whoever's watching this podcast.
Right. I guess one last thought with that, though, is like, I know sometimes if I hear that we need to talk, I just get that, like, that gut drop. Like, so.
What is this going to mean?
Yeah.
But it doesn't, but if you use it frequently enough, it doesn't have to mean that, right?
That's true.
Just let's talk when we're both in a good space versus I'm going to dump this on you right now.
Yeah. And that might be more on me just, assuming the worst versus thinking about what we've just been talking about with, like, do you want to do that now when everybody's all riled up? Like, or do you want to, she's giving you the warning or whatever about signal that you're going to have a more calm discussion, so you're not going to be attacked at a later point. It's going to be a discussion, so it's just telling myself to calm down.
And I used to do that with the kids, when they did something that, was either against the rules, and I don't know that we ever had that many, but,
right.
I would just say, I'm too upset to make a decision about this right now, or, and I know that, they would just walk away going, oh my God, but they learned that after the emotions were, ratcheted down a few steps, that it wasn't as bad, but we were going to come back and talk about it.
Right.
Because I think that's what's really missing sometimes. We think, I don't want to open this wound, or I don't want to rehash, whatever. But those are where you really make great strides in communication, is when you can, go back and say, man, when you do this, it really just grinds my gears, or can you wait, or, whatever it is that, and because, man, is the more that we can come together, as a family, as a coworker, as a whatever the relationship is, and it can come out better on the other side, we all win.
Yeah. But people don't always want to have those awkward conversations. But
Yeah.
Again, I think we are at a good stopping point, so we'll just call it. So thanks again for being on the podcast.
Absolutely.
And tune in for the next one. May or may not have a dog.